I've seen equipment fail in a dozen ways over 23 years in construction, but I'd never seen $500,000 fall into a river before October 11th, 1995. The leap heir, LTM-1160, went over at 9:47 on a Wednesday morning, and by 9:48, I was watching my career drown alongside it in the Middle Raccoon River. The boom hit the water with a sound like artillery fire, sending a plume of mud 50 feet into the air. The counterweight stood vertical against the Iowa sky, 8 tons of steel, pointing at nothing but my failures. What I didn't know, standing there in the October cold with my clipboard and my shattered certainty, was that the solution would arrive 5 days later on steel tracks manufactured in 1928, driven by a white-haired farmer who looked like he belonged in a history book, not on my construction site. But that morning, all I knew was the sick feeling in my gut as I watched German precision engineering settle onto its side in 2 feet of river water. The Middle Raccoon River crosses Carroll County in lazy bends through flat farmland that stretches to horizons broken only by grain elevators and tree lines. In October of 1995, we were replacing the County Road D25 bridge, a Depression-era concrete span so patched it looked like a quilt made of cement. Mercer Construction out of Des Moines had won the contract $2.8 million Thanksgiving deadline, and they'd given me the project because I had a reputation. Kenneth Clark finishes on time, under budget every time. 12 bridges across Iowa in 15 years. Not a single deadline missed. Not a single budget overrun. I was 45 years old, white with hair going gray at the temples in a way that made clients trust me. 8 years in the Army Corps of Engineers had taught me precision and control. 15 years with Mercer had taught me that control was everything. You plan the work, the plan, and nothing surprises you. That's how you build a career. That's how you prove you're not failing at everything the way you failed at your marriage. Rebecca had taken the house when we divorced 3 years earlier. I'd taken the guilt and the weekend visits with Nicole, our daughter who is 16 now, and living in Des Moines with a mother who'd learned to be disappointed quietly. The bridge project was supposed to be my proof that I could still build something that lasted. The Liebherr crane was the crown jewel of Mercer's fleet. I'd requested it specifically fought for it in the project proposal. $500,000 of hydraulic precision manufactured in Germany, shipped to Iowa in 3 pieces. It could lift 160 metric tons. Its boom extended 200 feet. The control cab had more computing power than the Apollo spacecraft, with load limiters and safety systems that made the impossible routine. I'd used that crane on 4 bridges already. It had never failed me. I trusted it more than I trusted most people, which should have been a warning about my life, but felt like wisdom at the time. The accident happened during the 3rd girder placement. Each steel beam weighed 42 tons and had to be lifted from a flatbed truck on the east bank, swung over the river, and lowered onto the bridge abutments. Christopher White was operating the crane that morning. 22 years of experience. Steady hands, the kind of professional who made difficult work look boring. I'd worked with him on 6 projects and never seen him hesitate. The survey team had certified the ground as stable. 4 hydraulic outriggers extended from the crane's base, pressing down on wide steel pads to distribute the weight. The math was simple. The load was well within capacity, the weather was perfect, clear sky, wind under 8 miles per hour, and everything was going exactly according to plan. I was standing at the observation point with my clipboard and radio watching the girder rise off the flatbed. My coffee had gone cold in its thermos cup. Christopher's voice came through the radio, calm and professional, calling out the numbers. Load at 42 tons radius, 85 feet well, within the safety envelope. The girder swung smoothly over the river, a choreographed dance of steel and physics. Then I felt something wrong through the soles of my boots. Not an earthquake, something worse. A shift, a settling the ground, betraying its promises. Christopher's voice crackled through the radio, no longer calm. We got movement, ground movement. The words hung in the air for half a second, while my brain tried to catch up with the disaster unfolding in real time. The east outrigger, the one bearing the most weight during the swing, punched through the surface crust and sank 18 inches into soft clay in less than 2 seconds. I was screaming into the radio, "Drop it," but Christopher was already dropping the load. The girder splashed into the shallow water and buried itself in mud. 42 tons of steel, $26,000 gone. But that was the least of my problems. The crane was tipping. With one outrigger buried and the boom still extended, the lee pair began a slow, sickening lean toward the river. Christopher killed the engine and scrambled out of the cab. I watched him drop to the ground and run mud spattering his coveralls. The crane's counterweight, designed to balance loads during lifts, was now working against the machine, pulling the back end up as the front end went down. The fall took 8 seconds. That's how long it took for my career to end, for $500,000, to become scrap metal for everything I'd built since the divorce to collapse. The boom hit the water with that cannon shot sound. The cab rotated 90 degrees. The counterweight stood up like a monument to my failure, and then the whole massive machine settled onto its side with a shuddering impact that I felt through the ground. Silence. Absolute silence. 25 construction workers frozen in place, staring at the impossible thing that had just happened. My radio hung useless in my hand. The October wind carried the smell of disturbed river mud, and somewhere a crow called out, indifferent to catastrophe. Christopher was alive, muddy shaken but uninjured. The girder in the river would need to be fished out, but was probably undamaged. The crane, however, was a different story entirely. A lee pair LTM 1160 on its side, with one outrigger buried 3 feet deep in clay that nobody had tested properly. That wasn't a problem you solved with a phone call and a tow truck. That was a problem that required other cranes. Bigger cranes. Cranes that could reach the machine without sinking into the same soft ground. That's when the real trouble started. I called Mercer's equipment manager in Des Moines. My hands were shaking as I dialed. The conversation was brief and brutal. How bad, Clark? Bad. Real bad. Cranes down girders in the river, outrigger buried in clay we thought was stable. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that sounds like career death. Fix it. You have until Monday to tell me how. Monday was 4 days away, and I had no idea how to fix anything. The engineers arrived from Des Moines that afternoon, 2 of them carrying soil testing equipment and the kind of grim expressions that meant I wasn't going to like their conclusions. They spent 3 hours taking samples, running tests, consulting charts. The verdict came back like a death sentence. The clay layer extended at least 60 feet back from the riverbank. Any crane heavy enough to lift the lee pair would sink into the same soft ground before it could set up. Brandon Lewis, one of the engineers, was a sharp kid fresh out of Iowa State, with a degree he believed in more than he should have. He showed me the numbers, the load calculations, the soil-bearing capacity charts. There has to be a solution, I said, hearing the desperation in my own voice. There is, he replied. 4 weeks of ground stabilization first. The math was impossible. 4 weeks of ground preparation plus 1 week for crane mobilization meant 5 weeks total. My Thanksgiving deadline was 6 weeks away. The penalties for missing the deadline were $15,000 per week. Equipment rental with the crane lying idle cost $3,500 per day. Labor costs for a waiting crew ran $8,000 per day. Every day that crane stayed down, I was bleeding $20,000. But the money wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the phone call I had to make to Rebecca that evening. I need to cancel this weekend with Nicole. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that held 3 years of accumulated disappointment. Again, Kenneth. There's a crisis at work. There's always a crisis. That's why I left. She hung up without saying goodbye, and I sat in the project trailer staring at the phone, knowing she was right. I'd always put work first. I'd always chosen the bridges over the people, and now I was about to lose both. Day 2 brought more experts and more bad news. An inspector from an Omaha crane company drove 3 hours to assess the situation. He walked the site, took measurements, consulted with Brandon and the other engineer. His conclusion matched theirs exactly impossible without extensive ground preparation. A Minneapolis company sent their own inspector who arrived late in the afternoon and left an hour later with the same verdict. I sat in the trailer that night, surrounded by rejected proposals, each one a different flavor of impossible. The insurance adjuster arrived on day 3. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a manner that suggested he'd seen this before and knew how it ended. "We might be looking at a total write-off," he said, making notes on his tablet. A write-off meant admitting failure, accepting that $500,000 of equipment was now a loss. It meant Mercer would pull me from the project. It meant my reputation would follow me like a shadow for whatever was left of my career. I didn't sleep that night. At 2 in the morning, I drove to the construction site and stood in the darkness looking at the crane's silhouette against the stars. The boom was still partially submerged, the counterweight still vertical, the whole thing looking like a fallen giant from some myth. I thought about Nicole, 16 years old, and watching her father fail at yet another thing he'd promised would be different. I thought about the 12 bridges I'd built, the perfect record I'd maintained, and how it would all be remembered for this one disaster. Christopher White found me there at dawn. "Boss, you need to sleep." I poured coffee from my thermos and watched my hand shake. Can't sleep, can't fix this, can't do anything. The conference call on day 4 was worse than I'd imagined. Mercer's CEO, the CFO, 3 regional directors, all of them on speakerphone discussing my failure in the language of contingencies and risk management. "Clark, we need a decision by Monday morning. Either we proceed with ground stabilization, blow the deadline, eat the penalties, or we write off the crane and reassign you." The word reassign hung in the air like a polite euphemism for fire. "Give me until Monday," I said, knowing I was lying. "I'll have a solution." The CEO's voice came through the speaker flat and unconvinced. "There is no solution, Clark. We've explored every option." "I need one more day," I said. "Just one." There was a long pause, then a sigh that carried across the phone line like judgment. "Monday morning, 9 a.m. Have an answer." I hung up and sat in the silence of the trailer, surrounded by blueprints and soil reports and the wreckage of my certainty. What I didn't expect was Larry Anderson. He showed up on the morning of day 4, driving a dusty pickup truck that he parked at the site entrance. I recognized him immediately, even though I hadn't seen him in 10 years. He'd worked for Mercer back then, a senior engineer with more experience than I had credentials. We'd been on a bridge project together in Council Bluffs when a minor accident occurred. Nobody heard equipment damage, the kind of thing that happens sometimes, despite all precautions. The investigation had found multiple contributing factors, but someone needed to take the blame. Larry had been that someone. I could have defended him, should have defended him, but I'd stayed silent. Larry left Mercer. I got promoted 6 months later. I'd carried that guilt for a decade, a weight that never quite settled but never quite lifted either. He walked toward me across the muddy construction site, and I felt my spine stiffen defensively. "Heard about your crane problem on the industry wire." His voice was neutral, giving nothing away. "What do you want, Anderson?" I asked, hearing the edge in my own tone. He pulled a rolled set of papers from inside his jacket. "Came to see if karma's real. Spent last night drawing up some ideas." I stared at him, unable to process what was happening. "Why would you help me?" The question came out harder than I intended. Larry looked at me with eyes that had aged more than 10 years should account for. Because 10 years ago, you were wrong not to speak up. But the crew didn't deserve to suffer for your silence. Same here. Your crew didn't tip that crane. The ground did. He spread the papers on the hood of my truck. The drawings showed a system of pulleys and smaller cranes, working in tandem, a clever approach to distributing load across multiple points. The math was sound, the engineering elegant, but it required specialized equipment that would take 3 weeks to source from different states. "We don't have 3 weeks," I said, feeling the weight of all the things I couldn't say. "I know," Larry replied, "but I thought you should have options, even impossible ones." After he left, I sat in my truck with his drawings on the seat beside me and thought about Grace. Larry Anderson had every reason to watch me fail to find satisfaction in my disaster. Instead, he'd spent his evening trying to help. The contrast between his character and my choices felt like an indictment written in blueprint ink. That night, Rebecca called. "Larry Anderson called me," she said without preamble. "Told me you're in trouble. Told me I should know you're trying." I was too surprised to respond. In 10 years of marriage, Kenneth the Freshby never heard you say, "I don't know," or "I need help." Her voice was softer than I'd heard it in years. "Larry said you let him help you. Said you admitted you were wrong." I leaned against the trailer wall, exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with sleep. The crane fell. My plan failed. Everything I thought I controlled just wasn't controllable. There was a long pause. "Good," Rebecca said. "Nicole needs a father who's human, not perfect. Tell her I'm trying," I said. "I will." And Kenneth. "Don't fight help because of pride." I won't. I promised, meaning it for the first time. Friday morning arrived with fog rolling off the Middle Raccoon River. Day 5 of the crisis. I'd called the CEO and bought myself one more day before the final decision, claiming I needed to walk the site one more time before we made it official. Official meant write-off, meant career death, meant admitting that 23 years of building things had led to this. The crew hadn't arrived yet. It was just me and the fallen crane in the October cold, the fog turning everything into gray shapes and suggestions. I walked the perimeter slowly, memorizing my failure, trying to find something I'd missed in the previous 96 hours. The math hadn't changed. The ground conditions hadn't changed. Nothing had changed except my certainty that I could solve every problem through planning and control. That's when I noticed the farm. I'd driven past it every day for 4 months, but I'd never really looked at it. Cornfield stubble stretched north from the construction site, broken by an old barn that needed paint, and a house with a porch that had probably seen 3 generations of Iowa farmers. A John Deere 4440 was parked at the fence line, and leaning against the fence was an elderly man watching me. Our eyes met across 150 feet of mud and morning fog. He was white-haired, weathered, maybe late 70s. Work clothes, mud boots, the kind of cap with a seed company logo that had been bleached away by decades of sun. He wasn't gawking like the occasional passerby who stopped to photograph the disaster. He was watching the way an engineer watches with purpose and assessment. He pushed off from the fence and started walking toward me. His stride was unhurried, but purposeful boots navigating the rough ground with the ease of someone who'd walked this land for years. When he reached me, he extended a hand. "Morning, Donald Torres." I shook it reflexively, feeling calluses that spoke of 70 years of work. Kenneth Clark, project manager. "I'm not here to gawk," he said, gesturing toward the farm. "I'm your neighbor. Farm the north section. Been watching your situation all week." "Site's closed," I said, the defensive response automatic. "Insurance liability." He didn't move. "I'm not sightseeing. Just came to tell you what I see." He pointed at the crane lying on its side. "Looks like you're stuck." "We're not stuck," I said, hearing the irritation in my voice. "We're assessing options." He nodded slowly. "You've been assessing for 5 days. Your crane's still in the mud." I felt something snap inside me, some last thread of professional courtesy. "Look, Mr. Torres, I appreciate the concern, but this is a complex engineering problem that requires specialized equipment and expertise." He didn't react to the condescension in my tone. "I can right that crane." The words landed in the cold morning air like something impossible. "Excuse me, I can right your crane," he repeated. "Not quickly, not fancy, but I can do it." I started to laugh, couldn't help it. The sound came out harsh and bitter. "Sir, that crane weighs 160 tons. It's lying on its side with one outrigger buried 3 feet in clay. I've had engineers and crane companies and consultants looking at this for 5 days, and nobody has a solution that works." He waited until I finished, his expression unchanged. "I know what it weighs. Know what my equipment weighs, too. What equipment? My grandfather's Caterpillar. 60 model. Had her since 1928. She'll pull that crane up like pulling a stump." I stared at this elderly farmer with his faded cap and his impossible claim. "You want to rescue a $500,000 crane with a farm tractor from 1928? "That's about the size of it," he said, and his voice held no uncertainty. No doubt just the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. I was 45 years old, standing in the wreckage of my career, looking at a 78-year-old farmer who thought a museum piece could save me. Every instinct I had, every lesson from engineering school, every procedure from the Army Corps told me this was insane. But standing there in the fog, with Monday's deadline looming and no other options on the table, I found myself thinking about Larry Anderson's drawings on my truck seat and Rebecca's words about accepting help and the simple fact that pride had never saved anything worth saving. I was either about to meet a genius or enable a disaster, and I couldn't tell which. Donald Torres drew a line in the dirt with the toe of his boot. Your crane weighs 160 tons. My crawler weighs 10. The math seems impossible until you understand what problem you're actually solving. You can't pull something 16 times heavier than you, I said, and the condescension in my voice was automatic protective. Not pulling to lift it, pulling to tip it. Different physics entirely. He drew another line intersecting the first, then a curve showing an arc of rotation. That crane's on its side. Center of gravity already past vertical. All I need is get it started rotate maybe 30 degrees. Gravity does the rest. Once past center, falls back on its tracks under its own weight. His boot traced the path in the Iowa dirt, like he was teaching freshman physics to someone who should have known better. The pulling force to start that rotation with the boom creating drag in the water runs roughly 12 to 15 tons. I was calculating in my head, trying to find the flaw in his reasoning. The Cat 60 puts out 65 horsepower at the drawbar. 3-speed gearbox. First gear delivers 22,000 pounds of pull at walking pace. He looked at me directly. That's 11 tons sustained. 11 tons won't move 15 tons of resistance. The objection came out sharper than I intended. Don't need 15 tons sustained. Just need to break static friction, start the rotation. Once the crane passes balance point, maybe 25 degrees, gravity pulls it back to vertical. I back off. Physics finishes the job. The way he said it, calm and certain, made it sound like the simplest thing in the world. Brandon Lewis had been standing close enough to overhear. He pulled a calculator from his pocket and started punching numbers his engineering degree, finally finding something useful to do. The math checks out, Mr. Clark. Theoretically. I shot him a look that should have reminded him whose career was on the line here. Whose side are you on, Lewis? He didn't flinch. I'm siding with the physics, sir. Donald continued as if the exchange hadn't happened. Your crane companies won't bring bigger equipment. You know why ground's too soft, I admitted. Exactly. Another heavy crane sinks same as yours did, but my crawler's different. He drew a rectangle in the dirt, dividing it into sections. She's 10 tons on 2 tracks. Each track 12 feet long, 20 inches wide. Total ground contact 40 square feet. Ground pressure works out to 500 pounds per square foot. Your Liebherr's outrigger pads how big 24-inch diameter, I said, seeing where this was going but not wanting to believe it. Donald nodded. 3 square feet each pad, bearing 40 tons distributed across 4 points. He did the calculation in his head faster than Brandon could pull out his calculator again. 3,000 pounds per square foot on the same soil. That's why your outrigger punched through. My tracks won't. Brandon looked up from his calculator. He's right about the ground pressure, Mr. Clark. 500 psi versus 3,000. The numbers don't lie. I felt something fundamental shifting inside me, some certainty I'd built my career on starting to crack. Christopher White had walked over during the explanation, mud still caked on his coveralls from the accident. Boss, this guy knows his stuff. The crane operator's endorsement shouldn't have mattered, but it did. With all respect, Mr. Torres, you're a farmer. My engineers have degrees from accredited universities. They've studied soil mechanics and load distribution and structural analysis. The words came out defensive, the last stand of a man watching his expertise get dismantled by someone in mud boots. Donald's expression didn't change, no offense taken or given. I don't have an engineering degree, had 56 years pulling stumps, righting overturned equipment, dragging stuck machinery out of places modern equipment won't go. Physics doesn't change based on price tags or diplomas. The simple truth of it hung in the October air. I'd spent 15 years at Mercer and 8 years in the Army Corps, believing that credentials mattered more than experience, that formal education trumped practical knowledge. Standing there looking at this 78-year-old farmer who'd just explained soil mechanics better than my six-figure consultants, I felt the foundations of that belief starting to crumble. Everything in my training screamed that this was insane. A farm tractor from the Jazz Age versus modern German engineering, but the alternative was watching $500,000 get written off while my career drowned alongside it. What were my options? There weren't any. The crane companies had walked away. The engineers had delivered their verdict, impossible without weeks of preparation I didn't have. Monday morning's deadline was rushing toward me like a train, and I was tied to the tracks of my own certainty. I thought about Larry Anderson's visit the day before, how he'd shown up to help despite what I'd done to him a decade ago. He'd given me drawings I couldn't use and grace I didn't deserve. Now this farmer was offering the same thing, help without conditions, knowledge without credentials, a solution that sounded impossible until you actually listened to the reasoning behind it. The real battle wasn't with Donald's logic, it was with my ego. I'd built 23 years on the foundation that I was the expert, the professional, the one who knew better. Accepting help from a farmer with a museum piece meant admitting I didn't have all the answers. It meant acknowledging that sometimes the smartest person in the room is the one without letters after his name. That stung in ways I wasn't prepared to examine. But pride had never saved anything worth saving. I'd learned that lesson when Rebecca left, when she'd told me that I valued being right more than being present, that I'd chosen control over connection and lost everything that mattered. Nicole was 16 now, growing up with a father who visited on weekends and missed the moments that couldn't be rescheduled. The bridge project was supposed to prove I could still build something that lasted. Instead, it had become another monument to the limits of control. If this doesn't work... The question came out quieter than I intended. Then you've lost an afternoon. Already lost 5 days. Donald's response was matter of fact, no judgment in it. What's this going to cost me? Nothing. No charge. The answer was so unexpected, I had to process it twice. Nobody works for free. Not working for free. If it works, donate to Carroll County Historical Society. How much? Whatever you think's fair. They helped restore the cat. I'm repaying that. You'll risk your antique tractor, your time, maybe your safety for a museum donation. The question revealed more about my worldview than his. That machine saved my grandfather's farm in 1932, saved mine in '82 when corn prices crashed, pulled equipment nobody else could move for 67 years. Asking it to pull one more time seems fair. The simplicity of his reasoning felt like an indictment of everything I'd made complicated. Bring your caterpillar, Mr. Torres. My voice had lost its mockery, replaced by something closer to respect, or maybe just exhaustion. Donald nodded once and turned to leave. Wait. He stopped, looked back. If this damages your machine or hurts you or makes things worse, won't happen. Such absolute certainty in 2 words. How can you be sure? Because I've been doing this since before you were born, and I know what that machine can do. After he left, Christopher came over and stood beside me, both of us looking at the fallen crane. Are we really doing this, boss? Brandon was checking calculations on his tablet, shaking his head in what might have been disbelief or admiration. The math works, Mr. Clark. I stared at the leap hair on its side, the boom still in the water, the counterweight pointing at the sky like an accusation. Clear the sight. Everyone back 200 feet when he tries this. You think it'll work? Christopher's voice held genuine curiosity rather than doubt. I think I'm out of better ideas, and maybe that's the first honest thing I've said all week. The phone call came while I was organizing the site evacuation. Rebecca's number on the caller ID made my chest tighten. I almost didn't answer, too exhausted for another conversation about canceled weekends and broken promises, but something made me pick up. Larry Anderson called me. Her voice was careful, feeling out the territory. He told you I'm in trouble. Told me you're trying. That you let a stranger help you. That you admitted you were wrong. I leaned against my truck watching the crew secure equipment and mark off the safety perimeter. In 10 years of marriage, Kenneth Fussmy never heard you say, "I don't know," or "I need help." There was something in her voice I hadn't heard in years. Not quite hope, but maybe the memory of it. The crane fell. My plan failed. Everything I thought I controlled turned out to be an illusion. The admission came easier than I expected, maybe because I was too tired to maintain the performance. Control was always your problem. You can't control everything. I know. I'm learning that the hard way. The silence on the line felt different from the silences that had filled our marriage, less hostile, more waiting. "Good," she said finally. "Nicole needs a father who's human, not perfect. Tell her I'm trying." "I will." "And Kenneth, don't fight this farmer's help because of pride. Whatever happens with the crane, don't let your ego make you stupid." "I won't." The promise felt like the first one I'd made to her in years that I might actually keep. After she hung up, I stood there holding the phone and thinking about the different ways a person could fail. You could fail by trying something impossible, or you could fail by never trying at all. You could fail by accepting help, or you could fail by refusing it. Rebecca was right about pride making me stupid. It had made me stupid about our marriage, about Nicole, about the belief that I could engineer my way out of being human. The 2 hours waiting for Donald to bring the caterpillar felt longer than the previous 5 days. I used the time to research, pulling up what I could find on the trailer computer. The internet in 1995 was still new enough to feel like magic, slow enough to test patience. Caterpillar 60 tractor specifications loaded one line at a time, manufactured 1928 to 1931. Largest crawler Caterpillar made at the time 10 tons operating weight, 65 horsepower gasoline engine steel tracks 12 feet by 20 inches. A forum post from some agricultural history enthusiast claimed they were indestructible if maintained. No electronic limiters. Will pull until the operator stops it or something breaks. Another post detailed their use hauling artillery in France during World War I, the kind of work that demanded reliability under conditions where failure meant death. Production numbers showed only 13,000 made total. Survival estimates put maybe 400 to 600 still existing, with 50 to 100 in working condition worldwide. So this wasn't some barn find restoration project. This was genuinely rare, genuinely historical. And Donald Torres was willing to risk it for a donation to a historical society. The contrast between that and my own calculations of cost and benefit felt like a moral education I hadn't signed up for. Christopher shared what he knew about the Torres family while we waited. Been here since the 1890s. Edward Torres, Donald's grandfather, came over from Germany, homesteaded the farm when Carroll County was mostly prairie. Bought that cat in 1928 for $2,800. Fortune back then, more money than most farms earned in a year. Family legend says Edward used to tell his son, "Right tool maintained properly outlasts the man who bought it." They rebuilt it twice, Christopher continued. Once in 46 after the war, once in 79. Both times the family did the work themselves. Took Donald and some retired machinist 5 months every weekend taking that thing apart and putting it back together. Cost $3,400 in parts. Labor was free because Donald said, if you can't fix your own tools, you don't deserve to own them. The information settled into my understanding of what was happening. This wasn't just a farmer with a tractor. This was 3 generations of knowledge, 67 years of maintenance, a philosophy about tools and work that ran deeper than quarterly earnings or project timelines. Edward Torres had believed in building things that lasted. Donald Torres had inherited that belief along with the machine. And here I was representing a construction company that replaced equipment every 5 years because the financing was better than the maintenance. We heard the caterpillar before we saw it. The sound came first, a deep rhythmic bark from a 4-cylinder engine that was louder and rawer than anything modern. It vibrated in my chest cavity, resonant and alive, in a way that made the Liebherr's computer-controlled hydraulics seem sterile by comparison. The crew stopped their preparations and turned toward the sound. What the hell is that, someone asked. Either our salvation or my final mistake. I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. The caterpillar crested the small rise above the construction site, and whatever I'd expected, this wasn't it. I'd imagined something quaint, maybe even cute, an antique tractor you'd see at a county fair and smile at nostalgically before moving on to the modern equipment. This was none of those things. The machine was enormous, taller than me, at the radiator cap wider than my truck, riding on steel tracks that looked capable of gripping bedrock. The engine was completely exposed, cylinders, manifolds, spark plugs, all visible and working and loud. There was no cab, no windshield, no roof, just a steel seat bolted to the frame where Donald sat like a captain on a ship's bridge, one hand on the steering clutch, one hand on the throttle. The tracks chewed into the gravel road, leaving marks that looked like a tank had passed through. Each track was studded with metal cleats that bit into the ground with authority, not merely resting on the earth, but commanding it. The machine moved at maybe 4 miles per hour, stately and unhurried, the kind of deliberate progress that suggested nothing would make it hurry and nothing could make it stop. 25 construction workers stood frozen phones out, everyone filming. The mix of expressions ranged from awe to fear to disbelief. A young worker, maybe 22 years old, stared openly. "Is that thing real? Real and running? Since 1928, Brandon said, and his engineer's skepticism had been replaced by something closer to reverence. "That's older than my grandpa," the young worker said. "Older than all our grandpas combined," Christopher added. My own reaction surprised me. I'd expected to feel vindicated in my skepticism, to see a museum piece and have my doubts confirmed. Instead, I felt something close to awe. The machine was magnificent. It looked serious, purposeful, built to accomplish specific tasks without apology or limitation. I'd driven a computer-controlled crane into the river through overconfidence in modern precision. Donald Torres was driving a 67-year-old machine to rescue it. The question of who was the real engineer suddenly had an answer I didn't like. Donald positioned the caterpillar 150 feet from the crane uphill, on solid ground, away from the clay that had betrayed us. He killed the engine, and the silence that followed was as dramatic as the sound had been. Climbing down took him longer than climbing up would have taken me 78-year-old joints protesting the movement, but his steps were steady and sure. He uncoiled a chain from the back of the machine. Not just any chain, a logging chain with forged steel links as thick as my thumb, rated 30 tons. Came with the machine in 28. The chain is 67 years old. I couldn't keep the disbelief out of my voice. Check it every month for 56 years. Not a weak spot anywhere. "How can you be certain?" He held up a link pointing to the surface. "See? No deformation, no cracks, no wear patterns." Steel doesn't weaken with age if it's maintained. Gets harder, actually. Work hardening. Brandon had come over to examine the chain. "He's right, Mr. Clark. This chain's probably stronger now than when it was manufactured." Christopher asked the question I should have asked. "What if it snaps under load?" "Won't. Rated 30 tons, pulling less than 15. "But it's old doesn't mean weak. Means tested." This chain pulled stumps through the Depression, moved buildings during the war, dragged equipment out of situations that would break modern cable. Never failed once. The confidence wasn't bravado. It was knowledge earned through decades of trusting your life to specific tools. Donald waded into the soft ground toward the crane, testing each step carefully. He wasn't guessing at soil stability. He was reading it, interpreting signals I couldn't see, making decisions based on information his boots provided. When he reached the crane's main frame, he studied it from multiple angles before selecting the attachment point. "Where are you hooking it?" I called out. "About 2/3 up. Right there. Why there specifically?" "Hook too high, I'm fighting the full weight. Too low, insufficient rotation. That point gives maximum mechanical advantage." The principle he was using became clear as I watched him secure the chain. The crane wanted to rotate around its tracks. That was the natural pivot point. He wasn't fighting against the physics of the situation. He was working with them, helping the machine do what it already wanted to do. Would take me an hour with computer modeling, I thought, and his answer would probably be better because he's seeing it rather than abstracting it. Donald returned from the crane covered in mud to his chest. He climbed back onto the caterpillar, and I approached before he could start the engine. Last chance to back out. He looked at me with patient eyes. You want me to back out? Part of me hopes you succeed. Part thinks this is insane. Which part's winning? Ask me in 5 minutes. I ordered the crew back 200 feet more for liability than safety, though if this went catastrophically wrong, 200 feet might not be enough distance from flying steel and legal consequences. Brandon had his calculator out again, probably running stress calculations on the chain. Christopher stood with his phone recording. If this is a disaster, they want evidence. If it's a miracle, they want that too. The insurance adjuster called just as Donald was preparing to start the engine. Mr. Clark, I strongly advise against unsupervised experimental recovery methods. I hung up without responding. Past caring about procedures, past caring about covering myself legally, past caring about anything except whether this was going to work or become the final chapter in my career's obituary. Donald fired the Caterpillar's engine. The 4-cylinder gasoline power plant coughed once caught, settled into its rhythmic bark. The sound came from another era, from a time when machines were built without the assumption that computers would save operators from their own mistakes. This was a sound that had built roads across America before the interstate system existed, that had cleared land before modern farming, that had done work when work meant something besides quarterly reports and efficiency metrics. My arms were crossed tight across my chest, jaw clenched hard enough to ache. Brandon stood beside me with his calculator like a talisman against uncertainty. The crew had their phones out, documenting what would either be an engineering miracle or a cautionary tale. I just wanted my crane back. That was the simple truth under all the complexity. I wanted to finish the bridge, make the deadline prove to Rebecca and Nicole and myself that I could still build something without breaking it. Ready. Mr. Clark Donald's voice carried across the distance between us. Proceed. My voice was steadier than I felt. This is either the smartest decision I've ever made or the moment that ends my career. No middle ground, no safe option, just an old farmer and an older machine, and physics that would either work or wouldn't. Donald shifted the Caterpillar into first gear. The tracks began moving slow and deliberate steel cleats biting into Iowa earth. The chain started to tighten, not snapping taut, but easing from slack to straight, one link at a time. The transition was gradual, methodical, the mechanical equivalent of patience. Modern equipment would have jerked the load relying on shock force. This machine applied steady, relentless pressure. The Caterpillar's tracks gripped harder. The grouser bars, those metal cleats welded to each track, Link dug into the ground like teeth, finding purchase in solid earth beneath the surface soil. Engine note deepened as the load increased. The chain hummed with tension steel molecules aligning under stress, 67 years of work hardening, proving Donald's claim that old doesn't mean weak. 10 seconds passed. Nothing visible happened. The chain was tight straight as a ruler from the Caterpillar to the crane. The crawler was pulling tracks, throwing small clouds of dirt behind as the cleats bit and released and bit again. But the crane wasn't moving. Not yet. Brandon muttered under his breath. It's not working. Give it time, I said. But my chest was tight with the fear that he was right, that this whole thing was impossible, that I'd just let a 78-year-old farmer wreck his antique tractor for nothing. Donald kept the throttle absolutely steady. He wasn't trying to jerk the crane over that would snap the chain and possibly topple the crawler. He was applying constant patient force, the same kind of force his grandfather had applied, pulling stumps in the 1930s. The same force Donald had applied for 56 years. Not fast, not flashy, relentless. 15 seconds. The crane shifted, maybe an inch, maybe two, a microscopic rotation of the massive frame around its grounded tracks. I saw it because I was watching like my life depended on it because it did. The upper structure lifted fractionally from the mud. A sound came from the crane's frame metal, stressed by forces it hadn't been designed to experience from this angle. A groan deep and resonant, the sound of physics arguing with itself. It's moving. Christopher's voice was quiet, like speaking too loud might break whatever spell was making this possible. Donald didn't react to the comment. He was focused entirely on the machine beneath him, on the engine sound, on the track tension, on the feel transmitted through the steel seat. He pushed the throttle forward a quarter inch. The Caterpillar's engine note deepened further. The tracks gripped harder, throwing larger clouds of earth. The chain's hum increased in pitch. 20 seconds, 2 degrees of rotation, then 3, then 5. The boom began to lift from the water, slowly dripping, rising like a mechanical resurrection. I couldn't speak, couldn't process what I was seeing except to understand that it was actually happening. The impossible was becoming possible through nothing more complicated than an old machine that didn't know it was supposed to quit. The crane rotated further. 8 degrees now. 10. The counterweight was beginning to shift its mass, starting to work in Donald's favor instead of against it. The same 8 tons that had helped tip the crane in the first place was now pulling the machine back toward vertical. Physics was taking over from brute force, just like Donald had said it would. Gravity was starting to finish what the Caterpillar had begun. 15 degrees. 18. 20. We were approaching the critical zone, the balance point where the math said the crane would either commit to returning vertical or stall forever. This was where theory met reality, where calculations confronted the messy truth of dirt and water and steel. Donald pushed the throttle forward another fraction. The engine roared, giving everything the 4 cylinders could deliver. The chain sang with tension, a note I could hear over the engine, high and tight, and 1 stress factor away from catastrophic failure. 22 degrees. The chain tension changed. I could see it in the angle, in the way the links hung slightly different. The resistance was easing. Not much, not enough to measure with instruments, but enough to see if you were watching for it. The Caterpillar's engine note lightened fractionally. The crane's own weight was taking over the work, now pulling itself back toward equilibrium. 25 degrees. Past it. Past the balance point. Donald eased the throttle back, reducing power, letting gravity do what physics textbooks said it would do. His voice carried across the construction site, the first words he'd spoken since starting the pull. She's going. Not addressed to me, not addressed to anyone, just a statement of fact like announcing rain. The crane accelerated now, falling back toward vertical under its own momentum. 30 degrees. 35. 40. The boom was fully clear of the water, pointing skyward, streaming river water like a giant wounded thing, finding its feet. Donald backed off the throttle, more maintaining just enough tension to guide rather than pull. He wasn't forcing anything anymore. He was leading a dance partner, not dragging them. 50 degrees. 60. The crane was committed fully now, gravity pulling it inexorably back to its tracks. The question was no longer whether it would make it, but how hard it would land. Christopher's voice crackled over the radio. Brace for impact. I wanted to call back, tell him to stay where he was, but my voice wouldn't work. I could only watch as 67 years of mechanical knowledge brought $500,000 of modern engineering back from disaster. 70 degrees. 85. Almost vertical. Donald was completely off the throttle now, the Caterpillar idling the chain going slack. His job was finished. Physics was completing what he'd started, just like he'd said it would. Just like he'd known it would, with the certainty of a man who'd spent decades understanding how things fall and rise and balance. The crane slammed onto its tracks, with an impact I felt through my boots. The ground shook. A wave of mud spread across the riverbank. The Liebherr rocked forward momentum, carrying it past vertical, then back, then settled. Upright, standing, battered and muddy, and with one outrigger bent beyond repair, but standing on its own tracks for the first time in 5 days. Silence. Absolute silence. The Caterpillar's engine idled quietly. The chain lay slack on the ground. The crane stood like a monument to impossible things becoming possible. 25 construction workers frozen, staring at what shouldn't have worked but did. Brandon with his calculator hanging useless in his hand. Christopher with his phone still recording. Me with my arms still crossed and my jaw still clenched, and something fundamental shifting in my chest where certainty used to live. Then someone shouted and the spell broke. The cheering exploded like a dam breaking. Workers whistled and yelled, slapping hard hats against their thighs, pumping fists at the sky. Two men hugged each other without embarrassment. Brandon threw his calculator in the air and caught it laughing. Someone blasted an air horn in 3 long, triumphant notes. Phones were everywhere, capturing the moment, documenting the impossible for people who wouldn't believe it otherwise. I didn't join the celebration. Couldn't move, couldn't process what had just happened beyond the simple fact that it had happened. Relief washed through me, but brought shame with it, a sick combination that tightened my throat. Relief because the crane was upright, because the project might survive, because Monday morning's deadline no longer meant career execution. Shame because I'd laughed at Donald when he offered help, because I'd treated his knowledge with contempt, because I'd valued my credentials over his experience and been wrong in ways that mattered. The crew was still celebrating when I started walking toward the caterpillar. Slow steps through mud that tried to hold my boots, deliberate progress across ground that had betrayed us once and might again. The distance felt longer than 150 feet, stretched by the weight of what I needed to say and the inadequacy of any words I could find. Donald sat on the steel seat with the engine still idling, patient and unhurried, waiting for me to arrive at whatever conclusion I was walking toward. I stopped at the base of the machine and looked up at him. The morning fog had burned off. October sunlight caught the mud on his coveralls, the weathering on his face, the calm in his eyes. Between us hung silence, while the crew celebrated behind me. What do you say to someone who just pulled you back from the edge? How do you thank someone for saving everything you'd spent 23 years building? How much do I owe you? The question came out inadequate. Told you, donation to Historical Society, whatever's fair. What's fair for saving a $500,000 crane and a $20 million bridge project? He considered this seriously, not brushing off the question. 10,000 would make them happy. They're building a machinery barn for antique displays. Need a proper space to preserve? What's worth preserving? Done. I'll write a check for 15. I reached up and shook his hand, a gesture that started formal and ended long, both of us holding on because some things can't be said with words. Donald. I need to ask you something. Go ahead. My engineers, crane companies, people with degrees and million-dollar budgets couldn't solve this in 5 days. You solved it in 4 minutes. How? He shut down the Caterpillar's engine. The silence that followed was as dramatic as the sound had been Iowa wind filling the space where mechanical noise had been. Donald climbed down slowly, joints protesting the movement, but experience guiding the descent. He leaned against the crawler's track, the way you lean against something you trust completely. Your engineers were trying to lift the crane. The observation was gentle, not accusatory. That's modern thinking. Apply force greater than the weight of the object. Overcome the problem with more power, more equipment, more technology. His hand rested on the steel track, fingers tracing patterns of use worn into the metal. But I wasn't trying to lift it. I was trying to tip it. Different problem entirely. Different math, different approach, different understanding of what physics will do if you work with it, instead of against it. He tapped the track twice, a gesture of affection, or maybe just acknowledgement. This machine was built in 1928. No computers, no hydraulics, no sensors. Just an engine, a gearbox, 2 steel tracks. Doesn't know how much it's supposed to pull. Doesn't have a load limiter telling it that's too heavy, you should stop now. Doesn't shut itself down when things get hard the way smart machines do. It just pulls until I tell it to stop. The simplicity of the statement carried weight I was only beginning to understand. Your modern cranes, they're smarter than this machine. They protect themselves, calculate loads, refuse to exceed limits. That's good engineering for normal operations, for the work you can plan and measure and control. But when you need to do something that isn't normal, when you need to pull past what the computer says is safe, the smart machine won't let you. My dumb machine will. The lesson landed with precision. I'd spent my career believing that newer meant better, that complexity equaled capability, that technology was always the answer. Standing there, listening to a 78-year-old farmer explain why simple tools could accomplish what sophisticated equipment couldn't. I felt the foundations of that belief crack and crumble. My grandfather ran equipment before computers existed. Used to say the operator is the safety system. The man is the computer. The man has to be smarter than the machine, whether that machine is 67 years old or 6 months old. I'd spent 23 years trusting machines over men computers, over intuition credentials, over experience. It had taken this farmer with a museum piece to show me how fundamentally wrong I'd been. The shame of it burned hotter, now that the crisis was over, now that I had space to examine my own certainty and find it hollow. The realization went deeper than the crane, deeper than the bridge. It touched everything: my marriage to Rebecca, my relationship with Nicole, the way I'd built a career on the belief that I could engineer away the messy human variables. I'd tried to control Rebecca instead of listening to her, tried to perfect Nicole instead of accepting her, tried to manage every aspect of every project instead of trusting the people who'd been doing the work longer than I'd been alive. Control had been my answer to everything, and it had failed at the things that actually mattered. You could have walked away when I laughed at you. Should have walked away? The confession came harder than I expected. I was arrogant and dismissive and wrong, and you had every reason to let me fail. Donald shook his head slightly. You were under pressure. People say things when the weight gets too heavy. That's not an excuse. It's just human nature. No, I insisted. I was arrogant. I treated decades of your knowledge as worthless because you don't have letters after your name. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. We're all wrong sometimes, Mr. Clark. The question isn't whether we make mistakes. The question is whether we learn from them. I'm learning right now. I said and meant it with a certainty I hadn't felt about anything in days. That's all any man can do. Keep learning, keep adjusting, keep understanding that the world is bigger than what you thought you knew. The conversation stayed with me through the rest of that day and into the weeks that followed. The crane inspection happened 2 days later when a leap heir engineer flew in from the company's American headquarters. He spent 6 hours examining the machine, taking measurements, checking hydraulic lines, and structural integrity. The verdict came back better than I'd hoped: bent outrigger hydraulic damage in 2 circuits, cosmetic dents across the cab and frame. Nothing structural. Machine is fundamentally sound. 12 days later, the crane was back in service. Total repair cost $18,000, compared to a $500,000 write-off that was a rounding error. We resumed girder placements on October 28th. Christopher White operated the crane with new respect, in his movements extra care, in his positioning the kind of caution that comes from watching invincibility prove itself mortal. The remaining 3 girders went up without incident. Final placement happened November 18th. The bridge opened November 22nd, the day before Thanksgiving, with a ribbon-cutting ceremony that featured county commissioners and a state senator and me standing there accepting credit for something I hadn't accomplished alone. I'd invited Donald to cut the ribbon. That's your moment. You earned it, he'd said, declining with the same quiet certainty he'd shown throughout. Me thinking, no, he earned it. I just managed not to wreck things further, but Donald had no interest in recognition, no need for validation beyond the work itself. The Historical Society donation mattered to him because it served something larger than ego. Public credit was meaningless. I wrote the check for $15,000 and delivered it personally to the Carroll County Historical Society. The director was a woman in her 60s who'd known Donald's family for decades. This is incredibly generous, Mr. Clark. The barn has been a dream for years. We'll name it after you. No, I said firmly. Name it after Edward Torres. He's the one who bought the machine that made this possible. She looked at me with new interest. Donald said you'd say something like that. Said you learned the important lesson. The letter I wrote to Mercer's CEO was more difficult, explaining that a local farmer with antique equipment had succeeded where professional crane companies failed felt like admitting professional incompetence. But the truth was the truth, and I was learning that honesty mattered more than image. The farmer used principles of mechanical advantage and ground pressure distribution that our consultants had overlooked. He succeeded because he understood the specific problem rather than applying general solutions. I recommend the company donate an additional $10,000 to the Carroll County Historical Society in recognition of the knowledge that saved our equipment and project. The CEO called me 3 days later. "Clark, you let a farmer fix our crane." The question could have gone either way. "Sir, I let an expert fix our crane. He happens to farm for a living." Silence on the line, the kind that meant actual thinking was happening. "Fair enough. We'll match your donation." The machinery barn opened in July of 1996, in time for the county fair. The Caterpillar was the first machine displayed positioned in a place of honor, with a plaque that read, "This Caterpillar 60, owned by the Torres family since 1928, rescued a modern crane in October 1995, proving that old wisdom still works." The story spread through the construction industry faster than I'd anticipated. Not as Kane's failure, but as creative problem-solving under pressure, an example of thinking beyond conventional approaches. An industry magazine called for an interview. I credited Donald in every answer, making sure the reporter spelled his name correctly, making sure the article captured that the knowledge came from decades of practical experience rather than theoretical education. The piece ran under the headline, "Old Machine New Lessons When Modern Engineering Meets Practical Wisdom." Mercer promoted me to regional director in 1998, 2 years after the bridge incident. The position meant overseeing 15 project managers across Iowa and Nebraska, responsibility for budgets in the tens of millions, authority to shape how the company approached problems. My first directive to the managers was simple: listen to local knowledge. Experience matters more than credentials. Respect the people who've been doing the work longer than we've been studying it. A specific example came in 1997 on a different bridge project over the Des Moines River. The young engineer, 25 years old with a fresh degree from Iowa State, proposed a $300,000 solution involving extensive ground reinforcement and specialized equipment. The site foreman was 68, had worked that river for 40 years, and suggested a simpler approach: use an existing bedrock outcrop 50 feet upstream, anchor the crane there, extend the boom further than the original plan called for. The old me would have gone with the engineer's proposal. Credentials, safety margins, cover your ass thinking. The new me asked the foreman to explain his reasoning, then approved his plan. It worked perfectly. We saved $220,000 and 4 weeks of schedule. The young engineer was upset at first, feeling his expertise had been dismissed. I sat him down in the trailer and told him about Donald Torres and the Caterpillar, about the difference between knowing principles and understanding situations, about the value of listening to people who've spent decades reading the specific ground you're trying to build on. The personal changes came slower but ran deeper. I called Rebecca the day after the bridge opened. We made the deadline. Bridge opened today. Her voice carried surprise. "I heard. Nicole saw it on the local news. She's proud of you. Can I tell you something?" "Go ahead." "I learned something important this month. About accepting help. About admitting when I'm wrong. About valuing experience over the need to control everything." In 10 years of marriage, Kenneth, you never said those words. "I know. I should have." Is this real, or are you just relieved the project finished? The question was fair more than fair. It's real. A 78-year-old farmer taught me more in one day than I learned in 20 years of doing things my way. Long silence on the line, the kind where I could hear her thinking. Maybe you're finally growing up. Maybe I am. Better late than never. The relationship with Nicole rebuilt itself in increments. I started showing up at her soccer games instead of promising to come and then canceling. Started being present at school events instead of arriving late and leaving early. Started listening when she talked instead of waiting for my turn to give advice she hadn't asked for. She noticed the changes around Christmas of '96. "Dad, you're different." "How so?" "You listen now. Instead of just planning what you're going to say next, I'm learning that the hard way." She hugged me, something that had become rare in the years after the divorce. "Keep learning," she said into my shoulder. "I'm trying, kiddo." I'm trying. Donald continued farming until 2001 when he turned 84. I'd see him occasionally at county events or when driving past the farm, always offering a wave that he returned with quiet acknowledgement. He handed the operation to Jonathan Torres in the spring, his son, who'd been farming alongside him for 30 years. The caterpillar was part of the inheritance passed down, the same way it had been passed to Donald from his father, the same way Donald's father had received it from Edward. 3 generations, 1 machine, a continuity that made quarterly earnings reports and 5-year equipment cycles feel shallow. The phone call came in 2004, 3 years after Donald's retirement. Jonathan Torres on the line. Mr. Clark, my father wanted you to know what happened yesterday. We used the cat to pull a combine out of Beaver Creek. Young farmer, 30 years old, had a $200,000 John Deere stuck in mud after harvest. Modern tow trucks couldn't reach it. Ground was too soft, equipment too heavy. We brought the cat, pulled it out like it was a toy wagon. Tell me what the farmer said. Jonathan's voice carried amusement. Kid watched that 76-year-old machine save his expensive combine. He said, "My combine has GPS auto-steer yield monitors, satellite uplink. Your tractor has a seat and a chain, and yours just saved mine." I found myself smiling. Same lesson I learned. Same way. Dad says that's how it should be. Each generation learns it fresh. Otherwise, the knowledge dies out. Give Donald my regards. Tell him I think about October '95 every time I'm tempted to dismiss someone's help. 5 years passed. I retired from Mercer in 2006 at age 56, young enough to enjoy it, old enough to have earned it. Consulting work filled some of the time, helping younger engineers avoid the mistakes I'd made. Teaching an occasional class at Iowa State gave me a chance to pass forward what Donald had taught me. The first lesson was always the same story: how a crane fell, how engineers failed, how a farmer with a museum piece succeeded. The call came early morning, December 14th, 2009. Jonathan Torres again, but his voice was different. Mr. Clark, I knew before he said it. When last night? Peaceful in his sleep, age 92. The words hit harder than they should have for someone I'd known for one day 14 years earlier. I'm so sorry, Jonathan. Funeral Saturday. Dad talked about you often in his last months. Said you were the engineer who learned to listen. Said that was rare. He talked about me, said you'd been young enough to change, that most men get to 45 and decide they know everything. But you'd admitted you didn't, and that had made the difference. I'll be there Saturday. Jonathan's voice held something between gratitude and relief. Thank you. It would mean a lot. After he hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed and thought about Donald Torres, about that October morning in the fog when he'd walked across mud to offer help I didn't deserve. 92 years. He'd lived through the Depression, the Dust Bowl, World War II. The Cold War watched technology transform farming from horses to GPS-guided tractors. And in all that time, he'd maintained the belief that simple tools properly used could accomplish what complex systems couldn't. The drive to Carroll County took 2 hours through December snow. Iowa in winter, beautiful and harsh fields, white under gray sky. I was 59 now, retired with nothing pressing except the debt I owed a man who'd saved my career and taught me humility in the space of 4 minutes. Some debts aren't paid with money or time. Some debts are paid with presence. First Lutheran Church had stood in Carroll since 1894, the same year Edward Torres had been baptized there. 115 years of Torres family history in those pews. 4 generations of farmers who'd worked the same land, maintained the same values, believed in building things that lasted. The church was packed. Seemed like the entire county had shown up. Farmers in Sunday suits they wore, maybe twice a year. Neighbors who'd known Donald for decades. People whose equipment he'd rescued over the years. The pastor told stories I didn't know. Donald volunteering at the food bank, mentoring young farmers who couldn't afford the equipment they needed, helping neighbors through hard times without expectation of return. I sat in the back, anonymous in a dark suit, feeling like I'd known only the smallest fraction of this man's life. That one day in '95 had changed my trajectory, but for Donald, it had been just another day of doing what needed doing. Jonathan found me after the service. Mr. Clark. Would you say a few words? I'm just someone he helped once. No, you're someone he talked about for 14 years. Every time anyone asked about the crane rescue, he mentioned you. Said you were the man who admitted he was wrong. Said that took more courage than being right. The front of the church felt longer walking toward it than any distance I'd covered. Donald's photo sat beside the casket, that same patient face I remembered from '95, weathered by 9 decades of Iowa weather and work. I looked at the assembled people at Jonathan in the front pew, at the faces waiting to hear what I could possibly say about a man I'd known for hours but who'd changed years. I only knew Donald Torres for one day of his 92 years, October 16th, '95. A Friday morning when my $500,000 crane was lying in the Middle Raccoon River and my career was lying beside it. 5 days I'd tried to solve that problem. Engineers with degrees, crane companies with million-dollar budgets, computer models, and soil analyses. Nothing worked. Then Donald showed up with a machine built before the stock market crash, before my father was born, before most of the technology we trust even existed. And I laughed at him. I'm not proud of that, but I need to say it because that's what makes what happened next so important. I laughed. Treated his knowledge with contempt, dismissed decades of experience because he didn't have credentials I respected. And Donald didn't walk away. He explained the physics, showed me why his solution would work when modern approaches failed. And he was right. 4 minutes. That's how long it took him to do what 5 days of modern engineering couldn't accomplish. But what he really did that day was teach me that new isn't always better complex, isn't always stronger credentials aren't the same as wisdom. He taught me to listen to experience, to respect knowledge that comes from doing, rather than studying, to understand that sometimes the simplest approach is the right one. He saved my crane that day. But more than that, he saved me from becoming the kind of man who thinks he knows everything, who can't accept help, can't admit mistakes, can't learn from people who didn't go to the same schools or work in the same industry. Donald could have charged me anything for that rescue. He asked for a donation to preserve history. He could have gloated when he proved the experts wrong. He just went back to farming. That's who Donald Torres was. A man who did what needed doing, asked for nothing, taught by example instead of lecture. I wish I'd known him for more than one day, but I'm grateful I knew him for that day because it changed everything that came after. Thank you, Donald. For the crane, for the lesson, for the grace you showed someone who didn't deserve it. Silence in the church, then quiet amens from men who understood what I was trying to say. Jonathan caught my eye and nodded thanks. I sat back down, feeling lighter, like a weight I'd carried for 14 years had finally been acknowledged and set aside. After the service, Jonathan invited me to the farm. Would you like to see her? The caterpillar Dad would want you to. We drove separately through December, cold, my rental car following his truck down roads I'd driven 14 years earlier in much different circumstances. The farm looked the same barn, same house, same sense of continuity that modern agriculture had abandoned in favor of efficiency. The machinery barn that my donation had helped build stood at the property's north edge, large enough to house a dozen antique tractors and implements. But the caterpillar had the place of honor positioned where light from the high windows caught the steel tracks and faded paint. 97 years old, still looked capable of pulling another crane tomorrow. Want to hear her run? Jonathan's question carried hope. Please. He climbed onto the steel seat where Donald had sat, where Edward had sat before him, where 4 generations of Torres men had learned that simple tools properly maintained could outlast the men who owned them. Chokeout throttle set 3 pulls on the starter rope. The engine coughed, caught, roared to life with that same 4-cylinder bark I remembered from October '95. The sound vibrated in my chest, resonant and alive, a mechanical heartbeat that had been working since 1928. Same sound that had pulled artillery in France, cleared land through the Depression, rescued equipment for nearly a century. Standing there in this barn, listening to that engine, I understood something Donald had tried to teach me. This machine had been doing impossible things for decades, not because it was sophisticated, but because it was simple. Not because it knew when to quit, but because it didn't. Jonathan shut it down after a minute. My son Nicholas is learning to run it. 4th generation. Same age Donald was when he learned. 14. Family tradition. Does he understand what it means? Not yet, but he will. When someone tells him something can't be done and he proves them wrong, that's when he'll understand that some tools are worth preserving, some knowledge is worth maintaining, some traditions matter more than efficiency. The years since that funeral have been quieter. I'm 64 now, living comfortably in Des Moines, consulting, occasionally teaching when the university asks. Rebecca and I never remarried, but we're friends in a way we couldn't be when we were married, comfortable with who we are separately, instead of fighting about who we should be together. Nicole is 35, a civil engineer following my path, but with wisdom I didn't have at her age. She knows the Donald Torres story by heart. Every time I'm on a project and someone dismisses an old solution, I think of your farmer, she told me last year. What do you do? I listen. Really listen. Because they might be right. Good, I said. Keep doing that. I still think about October 16th, 95, the sound of that caterpillar approaching the site of Donald, sitting on that steel seat, the 4 minutes when physics and patience accomplished what money and credentials couldn't. I think about the lesson he taught that sometimes you don't lift the problem, you tip it, that different approaches lead to different results, that working with physics instead of against it matters more than forcing solutions. But mostly, I think about grace. Donald Torres had every reason to let me fail to walk away from an arrogant engineer who dismissed his help. Instead, he stayed, explained, succeeded, taught. Larry Anderson had every reason to celebrate my disaster, to see karma deliver justice for what I'd done to him a decade earlier. Instead, he came with drawings and offered help. Rebecca had every reason to stop caring whether I learned anything, whether I changed, whether I became someone capable of being human instead of perfect. Instead, she called, encouraged, forgave. 3 people showed me grace when I deserved judgment. 3 people offered help when I'd earned consequences. 3 people taught me that the question isn't whether we make mistakes, we all do. The question is whether we're willing to learn from them, to admit when we're wrong, to accept that expertise comes in forms we might not recognize until we're humble enough to listen. Engineers laughed when Donald offered to help. The crane fell. The old machine pulled it back up. That's what happens when you build something that doesn't know when to quit, when you trust someone who knows what they're doing when you work with physics instead of fighting it. Donald taught me that in 4 minutes on a Friday morning in October, and I've spent 14 years trying to live up to the lesson. Every time someone says that old thing can't help, every time an engineer calculates limits and a computer says no, every time modern equipment protects itself from what needs doing, I think about the Torres family firing up the caterpillar, hooking a chain, proving the experts wrong. I think about Donald sitting on that steel seat with absolute certainty about the chain going taut, about the crane rotating past its balance point and falling back to vertical under its own weight. I was 45 years old when I met Donald Torres, thought I knew everything, and was wrong about almost all of it. He was 78, asked for nothing, and understood what actually mattered. I've never forgotten that day. The sound of that engine, the sight of that crane rising, the feeling of being saved by someone I'd underestimated. Because some lessons, the important ones, you only need to learn once if you're smart enough to listen. The world keeps getting more complex, more computerized, more protected by safety systems and load limiters and algorithms that prevent mistakes. That's progress, and I'm not arguing against it. But I've learned that sometimes the simplest solution is the right one, that experience matters more than credentials, that old doesn't mean obsolete. The caterpillar sits in that barn in Carroll County, maintained by the 4th generation of Torres farmers, ready to pull the next impossible thing. And somewhere I like to think Donald Torres is watching, satisfied that the lesson took, that the knowledge passed forward, that one engineer learned to value wisdom over certainty. He didn't need recognition or credit or anything beyond the quiet satisfaction of doing what needed doing. That was enough for him. Learning to make it enough for me, that's been the work of the years since.